This series is convened by Columbia Global and explores the evolving realities of displacement worldwide. Please visit our website for more information. My name is Antonio Campaña. I am the director of the Columbia Global Center in Santiago, convening this webinar in conjunction with our partner, the Columbia Global Center in Rio. In that light, I would like to introduce to you Ana Paula Vitelli. Ana Paula is the newly appointed director of the Rio Center, bringing more than 30 years of executive and academic experience in Brazil and worldwide. Before joining Columbia Global Center Rio, she served as managing director at Blue Management Institute, advising senior executives on strategy, leadership, and organizational culture. Previously, she served as regional director for South America at the University of Manchester. She has also worked at Fundación Getulio Vargas, served as a consultant for the UK Prosperity Fund, Future Cities Project, and served as president and chairwoman of the British Chamber of Commerce in Brazil. She's also the author of the book, The Invisible Woman, Life, Work, Pathways, and Choices. Welcome, Ana Paula, and I invite you to share a few words with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio, for the introduction. It is a real pleasure to join the session in a collaborative initiative between our centers. So this is my third week as in the role of director of the Global Center here in Rio. I'm really pleased to engage in this initiative. It's such an interesting and relevant topic and such a great audience here. So thank you very much for joining the session. And I hope that's very interesting to you all. Thank you very much, Antonio, for the time here for this brief introduction. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Ana Paula. This webinar presents an opportunity to affirm the importance of addressing the issue of hosting displaced scholars and to set forth a case for why universities and institutions must open their doors to scholars at risk. Universities have historically been the most protected spaces for free thought. But when these spaces are subjected to sustained attack and their faculty and scholars are systematically silenced for daring to teach, research, or speak in ways that displease those in power, society faces challenges that go beyond humanitarian efforts. It becomes a matter of protecting knowledge and academic freedom. The displacement of scholars is a fundamental issue of academic freedom and human rights. Scholars are often targeted precisely because their work challenges power, exposes abuses, or advances critical thinking. The ability to research, teach, and publish without fear of persecution is as foundational to an open society as freedom of speech or freedom of conscience. In this sense, displaced scholars are an indicator of democratic backsliding, and a reminder that academic freedom is not a permanent achievement. It must be actively defended, and programs that host displaced scholars are part of that defense. Displacement represents a profound loss of knowledge, production, and intellectual capital. When scholars are silenced or removed from their institutions, entire research agendas can collapse. This has long-term consequences not only for their home countries, but for global knowledge systems. The lesson is clear: protecting scholars in exile helps preserve continuity in research, teaching, and innovation. For host institutions, welcoming a displaced scholar often means gaining a distinctive academic voice, deep regional expertise, and cross-cultural perspectives that are difficult to recruit through conventional means. The exchange is generally mutual. There's a compelling argument about the relationship between diversity and innovation. Displaced scholars bring perspectives shaped by different political, cultural, and social contexts. Their work often challenges dominant paradigms and introduces new methodologies or questions. Supporting them is not merely compensatory. It actively enriches host institutions and broadens the scope of inquiry. In an era of mounting and systemic challenges and global crises, such diversity is an asset and a necessity, not a luxury or a liability. They bring first-hand knowledge of political repression, conflict, gender inequality, and human rights. Their teaching enriches students. Their public engagement deepens civic discourse. Their research fills gaps, that local scholars working from a distance cannot easily address. Displacement is not just a professional disruption, it's an epistemic rupture. Scholars in exile must renegotiate language, audience, institutional norms, and even the legitimacy of their knowledge. Addressing their needs, therefore, requires more than funding. It involves rethinking how knowledge is recognized, validated, and integrated across contexts. I would like now to introduce you to the moderator of our event, Manuela Orjuela. Manuela is a physician scientist and environmental epidemiologist at the Columbia University Medical Center, whose research includes a focus on youth and family migration in the Americas, examining nutrition, water, and food security in populations in transition on the move. Manuela, thank you for joining us to discuss this important topic, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Antonio, for this introduction, and thank you to all the speakers from the Columbia Global Center in New York. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this webinar and very excited to hear from our three very esteemed panelists. So I will now start. Our first speaker is joining us from Brasilia, is Silvia Corradi Sander. She's a protection officer with UNHCR, or as we know, ACNUR. Silvia holds a law degree from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, with additional training in public, international, and constitutional law. In the humanitarian field, she has 10 years of professional experience with ACNUR, including work in emergencies related to the current situation in Venezuela, the war in the Ukraine, and also with the flooding disasters in southern Brazil. Silvia also has extensive experience in developing protection and solution responses for refugees and other forcibly displaced persons across different regions of Brazil. As I mentioned, she's currently based in Brasilia, leading the protection unit at ACNUR. Silvia, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Good afternoon, good evening to all. First of all, let me start by thanking the Columbia Global Centers on behalf of UNHCR for inviting us to this very important discussion, especially now, as mentioned in the introduction, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the 1951 Convention. So allow me to start sharing with you that I will briefly mention where we stand in terms of global trends in forced displacement. So what are the main crises, what are the key quantitative information, and maybe looking at our work of different various actors, not UNHCR, civil society organizations, the academia, and other sectors also represented here in this webinar, maybe sharing Brazil as a case study in terms of a few possibilities and opportunities on how to address challenges that are increasing in this context. So, as you may know, every year during the World Refugee Day, UNHCR publishes the report Global Trends, sharing data from the previous year, data relevant to forced displacement. And what we see is that in 10 years, the number of people in different contexts of forced displacement has not only increased, but has basically doubled. Last year, when we launched the Global Trends Report in June, pertaining to data relevant to December 2024, we were counting, unfortunately, over 120, more precisely 123.2 million people forced to flee worldwide, including not only refugees, asylum seekers, but also internally displaced populations, internally displaced mostly by conflict. already representing a substantial increase from what we saw in 2023, which was 117 million people in forced displacement. This means that now 1 in every 67 people around the world has been forced to flee their homes. In not only here in the Latin American Caribbean context, but also in all 5 continents. Also important to mention that the majority, meaning 67% of these populations are hosted not necessarily in the so-called developed countries, in strong economies, but they are mostly hosted in neighboring countries, meaning in countries that are, to some extent, also affected by those crises that are creating situations of refugees crossing borders, or also people fleeing internally inside the borders of their own countries. And of which crisis are we talking about? So in terms of the main countries of origin, now, and as I mentioned, if we looked at data from going up to December 2024, on the top of the list, we would see the Venezuela situation with 6.2 million people fleeing the country or in context of forced displacement, followed by Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and South Sudan. And then in terms of host countries, Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Germany, and Uganda. And if we look at host countries, as I mentioned, most of them are neighboring countries of origin, the main countries of origin. And this means that main host countries, as I mentioned, are not countries with necessarily strong or the strongest economies, but 70% of refugees are currently being hosted in low and middle income countries, while 23% are being hosted in the least developed countries. Another thing that I would like to point out in this map here is that most refugees are also being hosted in countries that are also being those hardest hit, or amongst those that are the hardest hit by the climate crisis, meaning that refugees are being hosted in countries that are facing either severe or very severe climate risks. So as we see here in a map, countries that are marked in colors going from red to orange. So basically, what we see is that we continue to face more and more this the intersection between different reasons affecting the context of forced displacement, meaning people that have been hit by conflict, by severe situations of violations of human rights, are also being hit by extreme climate events such as floods and others, as we have been seeing over and over again, also increasing here in our region, Latin America, in the Americas region as a whole. So another point to make is that if from one side forced displacement is rapidly increasing, investment in humanitarian aid is proportionately reducing. So now humanitarian aid is at the same level as in 2015, so more than 10 years ago, we would see approximately $3.4 billion being used to support especially host countries. But in the past 10 years, this level of humanitarian aid has not only not increased, but is also proportionately reducing now, especially following severe reductions after 2024. So also this funding crisis, and allow me to say this is also a responsibility crisis, is of course heightening risks, especially to women and girls and to those most vulnerable populations that are being affected by forced displacement. So risks of violence, insecurity, death, and severe reduction of the prospects of finding solutions is also, of course, being largely affected. So maybe to conclude, in terms of solutions, what can we learn about some of the creative, innovative ideas that are being developed here in the Americas region? And I'll mention specifically the case of Brazil. In terms of the context, Brazil is now facing close to 1 million of people in need of international protection, what makes the country one of the 30 countries around the world crossing the line of hosting over 1 million refugees and others in forced displacement. In Brazil, in terms of the main countries of origin represented, we see, first of all, Venezuela, followed by Haiti, Cuba, Afghanistan, Syria, and then the list goes up to over 160 different countries of origin. Most of these, so in terms of the legal status, over 162,000 persons have been recognized as refugees, while 119 are still pending a decision in terms of their asylum claims, and the majority is now counting on alternative legal pathways, such as the so-called humanitarian residency permits, which are not as protective as refugee status. However, they also include substantial protection and substantial prospects or opportunities for local integration. So what we see here, and that has been mentioned globally, especially under the Global Refugee Forum, but also in other regional processes such as the Cartagena Plus 40 process, but also Quito process and other, what kind of examples Brazil has been showcasing globally and also regionally. First of all, and if we think behind or following the logic of a route-based approach, starting from the legal environment, overall, the legislation is very favorable to not only reception, but also access to solutions, especially access to local integration solutions to refugees and other populations in need of international protection. A point to make is that the Brazilian refugee law embodies the so-called expanded refugee definition inspired by the Cartagena Declaration, meaning it not only includes those affected by individual or group-based persecution, but also those affected by severe or grave situations of human rights violations, as considered by Brazil to be the case of Venezuela, Afghanistan, and overall the case of 6 countries globally. So very favorable legal framework. Also, Brazil has, for the past over 10 years, the practice of establishing humanitarian visas to some nationalities, applicable to some nationalities, as facilitated pathways for those in need of international protection to access the Brazilian territory and find protection under the asylum system or under alternative legal pathways as the humanitarian residency permits that I mentioned. Currently, Brazil has humanitarian visas being available to 4 different situations. So basically Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, and Haiti, and now transitioning to a linkage between access to humanitarian visas linked with a community sponsorship program. But still, the practice of allowing humanitarian visas to ensure that people in need can access the Brazilian territory and find protection is certainly something that can inspire similar practices. Then, as I mentioned, not only the asylum system is open to those that choose to access the protection as refugees, but also Brazil has been, especially for the past 10 years, increasingly establishing these complementary pathways for protection in the format of a temporary residency permit that can be transformed into a permanent residency permit based on local integration criteria, and this will allow the person from the entry in the country to access formal education, employment, free transit in the country, and other possibilities that will help or catalyze the process of finding local integration and solutions. Then also Brazil has a strong example in terms of a humanitarian response to a massive influx of refugees, which is the so-called Operation Welcome, which is basically in the northern border of Brazil with Venezuela. There is a strong humanitarian response organized in 3 different axes, including documentation at the border, registration at the border, followed by access to humanitarian shelter, followed by an internal relocation program that will allow people to voluntarily relocate from the north of Brazil to other states where they will find better opportunities to access employment or even entrepreneurship, and overall local integration and protection networks. Also, beyond a good example with good lessons learned in terms of how to organize a humanitarian response, Brazil since 2023 has been working on developing a national policy dedicated to migrants, refugees, and stateless populations. The development of this policy that has been published in August last year was followed by a substantial countrywide consultation process, which included consultations with over 14,000 people, including a majority of refugees, migrants, and stateless. And this policy will basically catalyze access to sectoral policies of education, labor, social assistance, housing, and so on. And this is becoming more and more the framework to organize at the national level, but also linked with subnational structures, strategies to make sure that inclusion will take place in each of these sectors. And finally, beyond the responses led by the state, by the government, both at the federal, but also at the national, but also at the subnational level, following the whole of society approach, it's important to mention that Brazil has a very strong academic network. A part of it is linked with the Vieira de Mello chairs, which is something promoted and supported by UNHCR, that is now including 51 universities around the country that are ensuring facilitated processes for refugees to be enrolled in universities, but also linked with best practices in diploma revalidation and other, of course, research, teaching, but also services that are being provided by universities to communities. For instance, Portuguese classes, support through legal clinics, support by health services provided by the universities, and so on. In addition to the academia, more and more we see community networks being enhanced. So for instance, we have mapped 129 refugee-led organizations that are directly engaged with local networks, supporting not only their own communities, refugee, also migrant communities, but also host communities. We also see strong networks in the private sector, more and more engaged in supporting refugees. And of course, the subnational governments. So this is just to share some of the examples in terms of what we see happening here in Brazil, also taking place in other countries in here in the region, and maybe that can be inspirational to think about creative, innovative solutions in the current context. Thank you, and over to you, Malu.
Thank you so much, Silvia. Really fantastic to hear both the overall work that UNHCR can share with us about the global situation, and then very specifically what is happening in Brazil. Really exemplary and a wonderful discussion for us to consider as we go forward. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Roberto González. Roberto González comes to us from the Pontificia Universidad Católica in Chile. He's a professor of social psychology, and he's a member as well of the International Network of Researchers on Migration and Public Policy. His research and publications follow a focus on intergroup contact, emotions, and intergroup relations, social movements, attitudes, and behaviors related to reparation in the context of political and ethnic conflicts. He is also currently the director of the Measurement Center, MIDE, at the Universidad Católica. And at the Universidad Católica has also held other key leadership positions, including head of the School of Psychology and the academic vice president. Since 2021, he has led the design and implementation of the university's interculturality program. In the field of public policy, he was appointed by the Senate of the Republic of Chile as a member of the Migration Policies in Chile Committee. He also serves on the board of the Migration and Public Policies International Research Network within the Department of Foreign and Migration Affairs of the Ministry of the Interior and Public Security. And more recently, he was appointed by the Minister of Social Development to serve on a national commission aimed at promoting public policies that foster social cohesion at the national level. So I'm thrilled to welcome Roberto to this webinar, and I pass the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much, Manuela, for your kind presentation. Let me open the file here. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. So first of all, what I'm going to present is sort of summary of reflection of the experience that we faced some years ago when we were hosting Afghan refugees in Chile. And the way we, a group of academics and members of the society as a whole, including governments, the church, and other social institutions, were helping to develop an approach to deal with this process. Indeed, those are the main team that was involved in this process when we were aware of the big issue that Afghanistan people were experiencing after the Taliban came back into power. And at that time, it was a North American foundation who were fostering the leadership of women in Afghanistan, who facilitate the resources and process to allow those families to leave the country in a very complex situation, as you may remember, when that crisis emerged. At that time, the government was helping them to arrive into the Chilean context. However, there were so limited, so basic tools to handle this that the people who were contacted by this American foundation in Chile start contacting people across different universities. And that's why we end up connecting with this initiative. That year was the beginning of our intercultural program that I've been leading for 4 years so far. So for us was really a big, real context in which we could join forces with members of the university community. The ASEN program worked for 16 months from September 21 to December to welcome this group and to try to integrate this family. It was a very complex situation because many of them, or the majority of them, just speak the local language, their language, but not Spanish at all. So language was a strong barrier. Only one person speaks a little bit of English. However, at the end of the 2022, they leave the country and headed to the US by land and crossing the borders of different countries. And I really found it fascinating, the experience of these families. They were searching for position that at that time Chile wasn't able to support. By the way, I was so impressed about the way Brazil has been facing the refugees program completely different from Chile. So here I'm going to describe briefly what we did as a group to gather the experience and to try to make some recommendation for countries that face this movement and changes in social issues. This is the families that were arriving. There were children involved, women and men, And there was actually one pregnant woman who obviously needed special need to be covered. The university connect with several institutions involving the health, the med school, the nursing school, the psychology, social workers, and the theology, the language. So many of the faculties in which were academics interested in contributing to develop an integrity program, joining forces in this initiative. Imagine those people were arriving to Santiago, and the first thing they managed to get was an ID legally to be accepted or included into the social welfare system in Chile. But that ID was the basic element. Then all the basic needs like living, places, income, social integration, language, everything was needed to be implemented in a very short time. When they arrived, as you remember, we're still living the pandemic. So there were in specific places out of contact with other people too. All these issues that you see in the screen were a critical component that the group started working very heavily and very fast. So the first thing we tried was the language, in which was critical for people to learn the basic communication skills. That was provided by the literature faculty, who were training language in Spanish for different backgrounds in the university. At that time, the government didn't have any program at all to support the teaching of language. There was also need of fundraising because those families were coming with very limited resources. So they needed funding for renting houses or flats. They need funding for cost of living daily. So all these resources were gathered by implementing social fundraising campaigning using social media. But also, it was a very critical issue to address physical and mental health issues. As you know, the COVID requirements were heavy in many countries, so the med school were incredible. So we brought a number of different specialists to deal with this process. And obviously, there were coming young kids. They needed to be into the educational system. On top of that, we needed to start searching for companies to allow providing job position for their family members. So for us, it was really important to build a flexible structure in which all these groups were coordinated different actions. In that regard, we start building the network, connecting with different private sectors actors, plus the state departments and the communities that were heavily connected to these families in need. We invite informal communities that create our support network was very fundamental, but also was very critical to provide emotional support. That family were experiencing a lot of trauma, leaving their countries, leaving family members in Afghanistan, and so imagining how difficult it was for them to face this situation. And of course, language was such a strong barrier to communicate with them. So we raised the awareness of this issue to understand how much these families were experiencing this kind of problems when fleeing to another country. For us, it was critical to formally identify them, to provide an ID. With the ID, you are able to go to the school system, to the health system, and get all the public state benefit, but also gathering information about how to get employed and get a salary, or education for the students, for the kids, and so forth. So facilitating the bridge with the community was critical. That's why we set up a mechanism that allows us to have someone staying with them permanently until they learn to navigate in the basic stuff, like taking the metro, buses to reach the university, or to go to a store and buy things in the supermarket, how to connect with people, how to transmit, because their language was very, very basic. The network was a very fundamental issue, and we took contact with people into the Afghan community in Chile. It was a very small group, but we learned about someone who was really critical because that person was actively translating, especially the very first months of this connection with the community. We created a sort of ecosystem collaboration program in the short-term commitment. So we invite people to join us because there were so many issues in parallel that we needed to address. So we set up a program coordination. So we have a team in which we make all the decisions in a very effective way, very fast way, and to open the discussion and to face obviously very unpredictable issues that we were facing all the time. The main issues that we were facing obviously was the fact that information was really not an issue in our culture. We knew very little about Afghan culture. We didn't have any prior language dialogue with them. There were a lot of expectation gap. Many of these refugees were expecting to reach places in which the state will support them and give them resources, but that was really extremely limited. And indeed, we learned the funding, the national funding from the government to support refugees program was equivalent to 1 year funding, research funding at the university. So you can imagine it was almost a very limited funding from the public state. On the other hand, this language barriers and the economic crisis were also facing a big issue. Remember, we were facing COVID, and that produced a lot of unemployment rates. So it was a very critical condition to help identify these people here into the system. So we knew in advance, because of the disciplines that were involved in this program, emotional well-being, cultural labor integration, and support for network were the three major components that we were putting together to facilitate the integration of these families into the Chilean context. So we learned a lot. It was very challenging, but it stimulated a lot of commitment. People who were engaged in this process were literally spending a lot of hours, but they were truly committed to help these families and to identify the mechanism to provide the resources and the needs to be fulfilled for different options. So that requires a lot of connection, state intervention, the government, the church produced a strong, important fact. They were the one providing the first place for them to stay for at least a month before we raised funding money to reach and let flat for all these families. Collaboration from the community in general was really an issue too. They helped to bring resources like housing, clothing, and food. But also the government and all the office, they were really critical in trying to address this issue and making connection with different state departments, education, health, for instance, but also the private companies. Private companies were so committed because they were opening the door for people to start working in jobs that at least provide them families with some income. So we knew that comprehensive support roadmap was critical to control for the expectation. Setting the expectation was very critical for the starting point because families were expecting to have better support for people, more resources, and that it was partly connected to the fact that after living in Chile more than a year, they decided to move away and transfer to another countries. The dialogue was critical. We faced a lot of cultural differences. So we maintained continuous communication with this family, and we established a flexible and monitoring process that allowed us to understand how their needs were fulfilled over the months when they were settled down into their communities. Training the volunteer was critical. We started working with students at the university who were playing with the kids by the time their parents were learning Spanish, for instance. We did formal program presentation. We collaborated with participants to complete the understanding of the main goal. We needed to set up the expectation of people too, because they were really motivated and sometimes offered things that were not possible to provide to them. So at the end, it was very important for us to do a closing meeting to present the results and improve the program for future implementation. Knowledge about the language was so critical. Learning about the institution like the ACNUR in the United Nations High Commission of Refugee is so critical issue. The previous presentation was so clear, illustrating how important it is for countries to learn the massive number of migrants, but also the need they have and how to involve programs, especially the communities and this government, in a more cohesive and integral way. Comprehensive knowledge within the government. is another critical issue. We know many officials are not very well understanding how to deal with this issue. And the institutional framework recently was also Ana Paula referring to this issue. Having institutional frameworks is critical. Support for the refugees in itself, that was so difficult, especially because of the language. We were looking for research people working outside the Chile to look for therapists who could talk to them in their own language. It was absolutely difficult to identify these people. Training the staff and comprehensive approach regarding resources for living costs. Imagine we facilitate money to them to the minimal wage salary to allow them to increase their salary by working in different organizations. But that was really tough. That was really difficult because it wasn't enough to cover their own needs. For the Spanish issue, I'd like to highlight this because learning a different language requires a number of adaptations, a number of initiatives into the language learning process. So here you have an example in which literature department deal with this way of coping with the learning process from people who are not having the roots, the traditional Latin roots for learning Spanish. So as you can see, this is a very challenging group, and that was the family who faced this situation and they decided to move for better life conditions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Roberto, for sharing this really telling example from the perspective of Chile, and serves as a wonderful comparison with what we had previously learned from Silvia. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Franklin Coletti, who Antonio had mentioned to us this webinar also showcases the program for displaced scholars. And Franklin is a historian and researcher with more than a decade of experience in university teaching and research focused in Latin American history and international relations. And he is currently visiting or the displaced scholar in residence, the Columbia Global Center Emerging Scholar at the Global Center in Santiago. His work adopts an interdisciplinary approach that combines diplomatic history, the history of international relations, and the study of forced migration and its political and cultural implications. He is working right now at the Santiago Center as his Global Emerging Scholar project on a documentary and also on cultural material analysis titled Migration and Memory, the Impact of Forced Displacement on Identity and Resilience in the Venezuelan Community in Chile. This project examines how the Venezuelan community in Chile reconstructs their identity, memory, and resilience following forced displacement, aiming to identify processes of resignification and cultural strategies that foster a renewed sense of belonging and collective resilience. Franklin, it was with great pleasure that we welcome you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Manuela. I'm here, my presentation. Can you see?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, just one thing, it's not yet in presenter mode.
It's not?
Now it is. Yes, great.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuela. Thank you to the speakers who spoke before me. Congratulations for your works. Today, I will discuss about migration in Latin America from long-term perspective, focusing on the role in shaping societies and driving transformations. So let me start with the main idea of the presentation. Migration in Latin America has been presented by some political sectors as a crisis, mainly due the collapse of service in the receiving country with migration is very large. But I would like to start from a different premise. Migration is not an exception in the region. It's a historical structure. It's a long-term phenomenon. Is it not only a crisis? Is it not a crisis? Is most and most importantly, is a driver of transformation. To understand this, we need to take a brief historical perspective. If we look at the late 19th and early 20th centuries, migration played a fundamental role in building the Latin American societies. European migration shaped labor markets, urban development, and national identities. Likewise, they contributed in the enrichment of the continent's cultural, artistic, and gastronomic heritage. So from the beginning, migration was not external to society, it was part of the societies we formed. But migration did not stop in the national level. It also shaped of a nation. During the 20th century, migration within in the region became increasingly important. Workers moved across borders in search of opportunities. This created a regional system of mobility and labor integration. And importantly, mobility exists before the institutions. Migration was already connecting the region before a formal integration mechanism. This became ever more evident with we look a period of crisis of displacement. In the 70s and 80s, forced migration became central. Authoritarian regimes displaced thousands of people, and were the dictatorship of Argentina, Chile, or Paraguay. But migration was not only a loss. Exile also produced intellectual networks, cultural exchange, and new forms of knowledge. Even displacement produced knowledge. For example, Venezuelan academia benefited for many researchers for these countries. This brings of the present where migration takes new form of scales. Today, we are facing in the national and regional moment. In the picture, the red points, we see the way of migration by land, and the line black is line of migration by air. Is of all South American people, but is the principal in this moment of the Venezuelan diaspora. And today we are facing a new regional moment. Migration in Latin America is new large scale and mainly intra-regional. The Venezuelan case is central. It's the largest displacement in the region history, but it's also an atypical complex. It is not classic refugee crisis. It's not purely economic migration. It reflects a process of structural collapse. It is not persecuted minority. It is not persecuted political opponents. It is the displacement of millions of people due to inhuman living conditions. But Venezuelan migration is not the only one in the region. Alongside this, we see the migration from Haiti, from Central America with its own particularities. Additionally, we have the natural migration from the rest of the country in the region who have successfully integrated into the host country. So Latin America is no longer a young region of emigration, but a region of mobility, circulation, and reception. However, focusing only on the scale is not enough to understand what's happening. Migration is often framed only as humanitarian challenge, but it is not enough. What did we actually observe as social adaptation and institutional response? Societies reorganized under pressure. So migration is not only stressed, it's also a process of reorganization. In the picture, we see the Chilean team of baseball minor in the Mundial of Baseball Minor is the third place, and all the players are sons of migrants of Venezuela. And this leads is to the point of the argument. Migrants are not only vulnerable populations, they are agents of transformation. They contribute economically and reshape cultural environments, and they build social networks. Migration is not something external to society, it transforms it within. If we take this seriously, we can see broader pattern. If we take of this together, migration drives transformation. It contributed to integration, innovation, and dynamism. And ultimately, migration reshapes the societies. So let me close by returning to main argument. We need to rethink migration in Latin America. We need to rethinking not only as a crisis, because it's not a crisis, but is a structural phenomenon and transformative force. Because understanding migration differently allows to design better policies to stronger societies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Franklin, for this wonderful presentation and historical perspective that really helps us frame how we think about moving into the future. So this is the end of our formal presentations. I would like to invite the rest of the panel to come back. We have quite a few questions for everyone and some topics for general discussion. I would also like to acknowledge to the general public, thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled with all of the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. And so we would like to extend our stay and welcome you to stay on longer. I know we're officially ending in 4 minutes or so, but we will extend the time of the webinar for those of you that would like to stay to continue the discussion. So to start off with our questions, before we address some of the questions that were put in the Q&A, I would just like to ask our panelists, to all of you, to please share your perspectives on the current state of the region in terms of regional and national political trends. We have several examples that also have some differences in them. So how do these current regional and national trends, political trends in Chile, Brazil, and also in Venezuela, how do these impact the de facto implementation of aspects of the refugee accord whose birthday we're celebrating? Whichever one of you would like to respond first. Silvia, I see your mic.
Sure. Thank you, Manuela. Maybe just to mention that what we see is that the protection space globally and in the Americas region, we also see it happening here, is becoming smaller and smaller. So borders are being closed, facilitated means to access protection, such as the humanitarian visas that I mentioned, are now becoming more and more an exception. Resettlement programs are largely reduced. And in terms of access to local integration possibilities, we also see that host communities at times are not perceiving refugees and migrants as Franklin rightly pointed out as development factors to host communities. So I think that one remark I would like to make is that here in the Latin American Caribbean region, we see many, many positive examples on how refugees and migrants accessing the labor market, accessing legal documentation, accessing international protection has been working as a booster for local development. I think here in the region, as mentioned also, the Venezuela situation showed us many, many good examples of how these populations have been contributing to host communities. And we also see how we cannot foresee what will be the next crisis. What I mean is, historically, Venezuela has been the main host countries to Colombian refugees, and then after a few years, the situation changes, and then we see most Venezuelans trying to look for better prospects in Colombia, meaning that we need to think not only how to further share responsibilities between states, between not only states, but between the whole of society. We see that different actors can do more and need to do more. So the private sector needs to be further engaged. The academia, and here this webinar is the perfect example of how the academia can also contribute not only to analysis, to these reflections, but also in terms of programs that will support the reception and integration of these populations. So I think now we need to further promote this cross-fertilization, to show that, as I mentioned, countries that are the ones hosting the largest numbers of migrants and refugees are often those that are receiving smaller support in terms of funding, but in terms of also political support, so more can be done. The 1951 Convention, in its 75th anniversary, of course, it's not the only instrument relevant to this discussion, but it's still key and central to those that are in need of international protection. So we need to go back to the convention, go back to other regional instruments, such as the Cartagena Declaration, and see how to once again show not only the needs, but also the benefits of keeping and enhancing protection and solutions here in the region and worldwide. I think also it's important to mention that, and once again, Brazil, I think it's a perfect example of how this diversity brought by these populations, and not disregarding the many challenges that cultural differences, language barriers will pose to local integration processes, but how this diversity is in itself a booster of social development. It's very much linked with the SDGs. So I think we need to visualize more and more what is working well, show that it is possible, show that everyone has a part to play in this in this conversation, and no one can be kept outside of negotiations and decision-making tables. No, so not only refugees and migrants themselves need to be at the center of this creative, innovative solutions, but we also need to make sure that it's not only states' obligations, of course. It starts with states, but it's a shared responsibility also inside countries. So I'll leave it here. No, I think that the Americans, Latin America and the Caribbean has a lot to teach to other regions also in the world. And we also have a lot to learn, no, from what is working well in terms of building solutions, while unfortunately humanitarian crises continue to increase globally.
Thank you, Sylvia, for that very helpful overview from your perspective. Roberto and Franklin, is there something you would like to add from your sides?
Thank you, Manuela. Very similar to what Sylvia was describing is what's happening in Chile. We've been implementing a national representative panel study for over 7 years. So we've been able to monitor people's general population attitudes towards migrants. And you can see a big shift into the direction of increasing support for restrictive measures regarding migration. So today is a highly consensus at the whole society that migration should be limited and restricted, are heavily supporting the strong border control and the use of resources for supporting migrants community. So the whole system turned into more negative attitudes towards migrants. People start feeling more threatening by migrants in terms of access to job positions and access to benefit in their own communities. I think it's partly because the economic situation in Chile went down significantly, and strongly after COVID, in which people start seeing more people in their community, but at the same time competing by limited resources. So the general view of this Chilean society is turning more negative, which also create a sort of big argument in the political arena, because the migration issue became a hot topic in the previous presidential election. And that is a big issue now currently, in which the country is implementing a number of measures, including a big border control. And obviously doesn't mean that control is not necessary. Of course it's necessary, but also the fact that we have a large group of migrants who need special attention, and especially a large number of undocumented migrants, which is a very critical question so far, politically, but in terms of resources too. So what's happening with these people who are not regularly into the system? So I would commend that now to lead Franklin to comment to.
Yes, I think same that you and Sylvia, and I think the close the this thinkings is in the internal mean we need to think the migration is a natural movement of all the humans. In the history, the migration as the tool of the development of the nations, and Latin America is is a continent of migrated of me the actual situation of refugees is very very sad, but is on today is from cycles. Is today Venezuela and Haiti and Central America, and after this time is other, and the movement is not stop, is forever and ever, is all the migration movement in America and all the world.
Franklin, thank you. That's a perfect segue for a couple of the questions from the public, because I think really what's clear is what we have been able to learn and that you have shared in terms of both the perspective from the UN organizations and then from the civil society examples from Chile, and the historical perspective is that clearly what we learn from these are lessons that we need to take forward, because this is something that's going to recur. And as Franklin said, it's not a crisis. So some of the questions in terms of moving forward to share with our panelists, one, in terms of solutions, and I think this is this question was for all, from one member of the public, Mariana, who asked if there are more specific ideas on how the private sector could be engaged and what role. And I think that's something we've talked less about. So I'm starting a little bit out of order of the questions that came, but I wanted to ask for input on the private sector. Whoever wants to tackle it first.
Should I kick off
Sure.
Franklin, Roberto? So I think that the private sector, one, I think, of course, can contribute, but can also largely benefit from including the capacities of refugees and migrants amongst their workforce, right? So what we see is that over and over again, the private sector, once they are exposed to an active effort of inclusion of refugees and migrants amongst their workforce, is that this diversity will also be very effective in terms of helping the companies grow, right? So I think maybe just one simple example. Here in Brazil, for the past several years, there is this project named Empowering Refugee Women, which starts with companies coordinating with UNHCR, the Global Compact, and other partners from civil society to identify, in this case, refugee women that may be linked with the gaps to be filled out in companies. And companies will provide professional training, and then in the end of this professional training, those trained will be immediately hired by companies. And this can be framed in different ways, right? Per sector, or looking at particular groups of women by nationality, by their location in the country. So I think this is a very positive example that here in Brazil, it started with a small group of 20 refugee women, and then it continued to grow. And now we have a few hundreds of women participating in these training sessions. And then, as I said, linked with job positions. Another possibility is that at times we see that companies need support in terms of bridging them with these populations. So they want to hire, they want to do more, but they don't really know how to access these populations, how to identify specific profiles. So in order to build these bridges, one example is here we have this hub of companies with refugees that basically will gather companies to, once again, promote within the private sector cross-fertilization. So how can you address cultural differences inside your company? How can you facilitate maybe access to or link refugees with recognition of professional certificates or diplomas that will be relevant to fill out the gap in the workforce of the company. So these hubs of companies, so we have a national platform, and now we also have state level platforms to, as I said, gather companies, and small companies can learn from the big ones and the other way around. So I think it's a matter of building platforms to coordinate this positive will to further include these populations in opportunities by the private sector.
Thank you, Silvia. Roberto?
Yes, I was immediately thinking about the role of the private sector. To be honest, it's a very complex question, because not many institutions are well prepared to especially deal with migrants or refugees coming from different backgrounds. Cultural backgrounds request a lot of sort of open-mindedness to be prepared to think that diversity could lead to more challenging work environments. And is research showing that the more diverse the environment increases creativity, for instance, but also requires a lot of sort of cost, because it takes time to accommodate, to learn, to navigate how the work is done. So that process, in a way, limits the number of companies that are willing to, engage and to open their doors for including migrants or refugees into their production system. Actually, the company who was really open here was one of the traditional pizza companies. So it was a very simple kind of task, very important task. And that company was really, really flexible in introducing these people who hardly ever speak because of language barriers, but they were perfectly okay working, and they're very good, successful worker. After a while, they learn how to do this job. So there's a lot of work to do and to provide evidence of what happened when the companies open the door for this kind of a connection with the migrants or the refugees program. So the evidence should be clear in terms of changing the barriers, and especially the negative disposition, because it requires energy, it requires commitment to, involve migrants and refugees. But also you can see, as Silvia was suggesting, the benefit that brings about when you connect with them. So this is part of the role of the universities too, to provide and discuss this information, and the ACNUR programs are so important to create and sensibilize people, organization leaders in the working marketplaces.
That's a great final reflection, to think of really the role that is precisely one of what can forums such as these facilitate, and that perhaps that's a somewhat untapped resource now, is to say, okay, how can we use the university connection sometimes to the private sector more effectively, perhaps as a way to bridge to these potential markets and workforces. Franklin, from your perspective, are there lessons learned that we're ignoring as we think about
Yes,
incorporating the private sector?
yes. In historical perspective, the capitals of the migrants in the country has been a fundamental papel,
Role.
participation.
Mhm.
Is like Roberto and Silvia, the perspective of the markets, of the laboral markets, and one very interesting from the country receive is the professionals the professional migrants, because are formed, formed and are capacitated in the country, in the in this country, and arrive in new country with knowledge in different areas. This is a different capital, but is a capital very strong from the nations.
Thank you, Franklin. Yes, I think very much an importance of the perspective of considering how to best take advantage of and learn from what may be brought that might not obviously fit in at first glance. I wanted to bring in, I know that we need to close, but I wanted to bring in one of the very early questions that was first brought to us, but just to adapt it a little bit, because we are actually, this is being sponsored by the Committee on Forced Migration. And one of the aspects that one person brought as a general question, actually specifically she brought it to Silvia, but I think it's one that applies to all, is that we also think that Amazonian countries, but I think we can also include the Southern Cone in this. They're passing through other situations of displacement, of forced displacement from climate change and land destructions, and so. As we think about this problematic and of the 1951 convention, you know, how do we factor in the additional aspect of the different forced displacements that are happening also internally and internationally, I think, as we think about the region, that are due to climate factors. So just before we close, I don't know if any of you would like to address that. I think it's a reality for all the countries.
Thank you, Manuela. Franklin, Roberto, do you want to start this time? Should I? Okay.
Go for it.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you. Very kind. So, very good question. I think that unfortunately what we see is, as I mentioned, is that more and more forced displacement is taking place because of climate-related events, climate extreme events, including severe drought, floods, and other. At the same time, people that are already in forced displacement, for instance, refugees, are those amongst the hardest hit by those events, being once again displaced. Here in Brazil, we have a recent example from 2024 when in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul, over 800,000 people were displaced by severe floods taking place that year. And amongst those over 800,000 people being displaced, mostly inside that state, we found over 43,000 refugees and migrants, mostly from Venezuela and Haiti. So what to do? And then in the Brazilian Amazon region, we see that not only floods, but mostly severe drought is even causing forced immobilization, meaning people that are being isolated because they no longer have the river that was the basis for their transportation. So another different phenomena. No? While in the coast of Brazil, we also see traditional communities of fishermen being losing their territories because of the sea level rising and so on. Here, one of the things, first, in terms of the legal framework, I think it's important to highlight that forced displacement directly related to climate extreme events happen mostly inside of the borders of the country. So it's mostly a matter of internal displacement. Here, the Americas region, I think we have numbers also doubling each year. If I'm not mistaken, according to the last grid report from IDMC, in 2024, so the report usually published in May of each year. So according to the report published last year, for instance, in the case of Brazil, Brazil was the second country on the list here in the Americas region with the higher numbers of internal displacements, followed only by the US. And this is mostly because of the disaster that happened in the south of the country, as I mentioned. So we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it under, I think, through different perspectives. As I said, one is how to make sure that legal frameworks are inclusive to these situations. So both in terms of developing legislation related to internal displacement, to IDPs, how to address situations of IDPs that are usually not only related to climate extreme events, but we see an intersection of different of conflict, intersecting with climate extreme events, intersecting with other situations, and then causing internal displacement. So, for instance, here in Brazil, there is no dedicated legislation to IDPs. There are a few bills pending discussion at the National Congress. So I think it's important to look at the legal framework. Also, in terms of international displacement, what we see, and from UNHCR's perspective, the 1951 Convention and, in our case in the region, the Cartagena Declaration, they are sufficient to discuss displacement that has in one of its layers phenomenon that is related to climate extreme events, meaning that we can use the 1951 Convention, we can use the Cartagena expanded refugee definition that will touch upon situations of grave and generalized human rights violations to also make sure that they will protect those in international displacement. So, legal framework. In terms of the inclusion in national policy, one of the things that as UNHCR we have been bringing to COPs, including COP30 in Brazil last year and over in other COPs, is that national adaptation plans, the so-called NAPs, and the NDCs are not so far mentioning sufficiently neither forced displacement, neither human mobility, refugees, migrants. So we have some work to do in terms of including displacement as a key topic in climate-related discussions. This is relevant to COP, but also relevant to national climate plans, national adaptation strategies, subnational adaptation strategies. So in a nutshell, from our side, and once again, using the example that I'm closer to here working currently in Brazil, our advocacy is to, one, when we look at the most vulnerable populations being affected by the impacts of climate change, let's also actively include refugees and migrants, right? Because of the gaps in terms of socioeconomic inclusion, continue to push these populations to neighborhoods or to areas that are more prone to disaster. So let's consider them amongst those that are mostly vulnerabilized, and also make sure that they are included in preparedness and response plans. Secondly, we need to include indicators that are relevant to measure and to address forced displacement in climate-related discussions. So we need data, we need data translated in the form of evidence-based policy, indicators, and so on. So we need to try to, one, prevent forced displacement because of climate extreme events, and if not possible to prevent, we need to know how to better address them, right? Through adaptation, through even linking this also with mitigation strategies and so on. So I'll over to you again, Manuela.
Thank you. Although I think that last bit that you're saying at least allows something from the academic perspective that where we can contribute. But Roberto Franklin, would you like to add something?
Franklin, would you? Okay. A really interesting issue. I think we share the fact that people are not connecting climate change crisis with migration here in Chile either. Mostly is regarding, affecting economies development, productions, especially drought. We have drought in the north, earthquakes everywhere in the country, the north and the central and the south. And in the south, we have floods, which is very common too. But what we have is settlement, a settled camp of people living in very populated areas in which many of them are overtaking lands illegally, but they become real actual towns with massive amount of people who are mostly refugees and migrants. So those campamentos we call in Spanish are places in which you can see a lot of vulnerable situation. So the drought issue in the north could be a very relevant factor influencing these people's life in many respects. In the south, because of a large area, we don't have areas with overpopulation, but the majority of them are settled in Santiago. Santiago is the largest city, about 8 million people. Chile has almost 20 million people in total. So Santiago, especially the peripheric areas, are the one in which you can see large group of migrants living there. And that's the critical issues when people move internally from one region to another, they end up in the large cities looking for better economic perspective and expectation. But that's the major consequence. No one even link climate change issues with migration. So I think it's a very interesting topic that you raised, Sylvia.
Franklin, before we close, anything you'd like to add?
Nothing to add.
Okay. So thank you very much to our panelists and to our all of the audience members that have kindly stayed on. Well, we really kept in Latin time, but it really a fascinating discussion. And just to summarize, I think what we've learned is really examples of from the region. What we can learn from seeing an example of a very organized national response, and then also seeing from one of our highest income settings, the real important role of community level and civil society from the host community in terms of working with migrant non-crises, since we'll think of it in that perspective, and just these complementary ways of what we can learn as we move forward. And I think it's clear we need to think more about strategies for sharing their responsibilities across both organized national responses, but also more civil society responses, and what still needs development, which is improving networking, potentially through academia, to the private sector, and really refocusing and remembering that we shouldn't look at migration as migration crises, but also increasingly be thinking about the role of host communities, potentially as we think about forced migration that is impacting both the migrant populations, but also the host communities. And one such setting is certainly those changes, the forced migration that is happening because of climate crises. Those I think we can call crises. But overall, I think something that is a topic that's very relevant, will remain relevant for our region, and which will require thinking from all of our sectors on better policies and acceptable ways for general society for moving forward. So with that, I will close. Thank you to both the Santiago and Rio Global Centers. Thank you to our wonderful panel for a really enriching discussion. And thank you to all of our public who stayed on for extra time. Yes, so Antonio and Ana Paula, many thanks, and to Chris for organizing this. And it's been a great pleasure and honor to get to moderate this. So thank you all.